Let's see, who was not here last month? Okay. Well, we'll just review a few of the things. I mean, we went, what, a couple hours? I can't repeat the whole thing. So a little background on the Grail. We'll just begin with that, some history here. Summary of the Grail literature, and this is from actually a pretty good book. It's kind of scholarly if you can handle a little bit of a scholarly approach to it. But Roger Sherman Loomis is considered one of the preeminent Grail scholars of the last 50 years. So he kind of gives this summary of the preeminent literature. The Conte del Grail, or Perceval, that was by Chrétien de Troyes. As it says, he was a poet of Champagne for Philip, Count of Flanders. There was 4 long continuations of the same. 2 were anonymous, one by Menessier and one by Guibert de Montreal. Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. This is my favorite one. I mean, he really gets into, he's very explicit on the cosmic connection with the Grail. And this, as it says, was the main inspiration for Wagner's Parsifal. And then the Welsh prose romance, Peredur, which was part of this collection called the Mabinogion. The Dido Perceval, a French prose romance, so called from the name of a former owner of the manuscript. And Parlez-vous, which I think you can download this online if you're interested. I think if you go to Google Scholar, I think you can actually download this. I think that's where I don't think that's where I originally found it, but yeah, I believe you can. On the prose, Lancelot, which forms the 3rd member of a vast compilation known as the Vulgate Cycle, the Quest de Saint Grail, or Graal, the 4th member of the same cycle. Mallory, that's Thomas Mallory, had made us familiar with most of the Grail material in the Lancelot and the Quest by his abridged version in books 11 to 17 of the Book of King Arthur. If any of you have ever seen John Boorman's treatment of the Grail material in the movie Excalibur, that was taken mostly from Thomas Mallory's work. And if you read through the Grail literature, this is one of the things I was emphasizing last month, was that it's quite varied. I mean, they all describe different things. I mean, if you read through the literature, it's almost quite confusing because of the diversity of descriptive material for the Grail. Like, you come away from it, what is it? What is the Grail actually? And of course, what most people associate with the Grail is the cup or the chalice. Is probably the most familiar symbol that's associated with the Grail, and there's important reasons for that. Joseph de Hermathie by the Burgundian poet Robert Deberon, the Histoire de Saint Graal, the 1st member of the Vulgate Cycle. All of these here were all composed within 50 years, from between 1180 roughly and 1230. And I talked about this time of very potent time creatively and philosophically that occurred during the High Middle Ages, when you had the peak of the Templar Knights, the Cathar movement, schools of Kabbalah being established in Spain. You had the troubadours, and that's just the beginning. And of course, the building of the Gothic cathedrals during that era was at its peak, at its pinnacle in that period. The tarot cards made their first appearance on the historical stage during that period of the High Middle Ages. So it was a very incredible time. And last month I talked about how that time sort of emerged in an era where it came right on the heels of the Dark Ages. And it's important to understand what the Grail is talking about. It's important to place it within this historical context. The Dark Ages came on roughly around 540 AD. And it wasn't something that came on gradually. It was something that came on quite rapidly within say, a geographical or rather a geological context. It wasn't something that took many, many years. It gradually shifted in. It was something that now scientists, primarily who study climate change, who've looked at like dendrochronologists, for example, who study tree rings, were able to actually discern that it came on literally within 1 or 2 years, around 536 AD. And I did talk about this last month, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time reiterating that, but just again to kind of establish a context here, what we see was that around between 536 and 544 AD, there was a major climate downturn in the Northern Hemisphere. And this has now been well documented in the Northern Hemisphere, throughout Europe, throughout North America. And one of the things that first clued these dendrochronologists to the fact that there had been this climate downturn was the fact that forest growth in the Northern Hemisphere almost came to a complete halt for about a decade. Now that's a pretty severe event, whatever it was that would happen. If you think that forest growth basically stops for all practical purposes. If we look at the historical record from that time, what we discover is that there were many references to the pallor, the bleakness of the atmosphere, repeated references to the sun not showing for weeks at a time. So it wasn't just a metaphor. There really was, in effect, a dark age that came over the world, or large parts of the world, around 540 AD. One of the things that happened as a result of that is the climate cooling caused a series of succession of agricultural collapses. In the wake of those agricultural collapses, there was famine. People in Europe, we don't know historically what happened in North America like we do what happened in Europe, but we certainly know that in Europe there were massive famines because of the crop failures and so forth. Those famines left people in a state of malnourishment, and in 542 AD, the Justinian plague came in and wiped out about a third of the population of Europe. Now, for the next 2 or 3 centuries, the climate of Europe and probably all of North America was depressed. It was in a state of cold and damp, and this is what has been referred to as the Dark Ages. And learning pretty much disappeared from the historical stage, except for a few isolated places like the monasteries in Ireland was one place that learning was able to survive during this period. But then we get to about the 900s, and we see that the Dark Ages basically disappear, and what we have is the return of the light. Warmth comes back into the world, into the Northern Hemisphere. With that warmth came prosperity in its wake, because now you had agricultural abundance. People started being able to eat well again. Lifespans increased. Infant mortality decreased as a result of both of those things. Population began to grow. And so what you had was, at least like in Europe may have been an analog for what was going on throughout the Northern Hemisphere. What we then see happening is that there was this accumulated wealth. And without a century and a half, roughly, of this prosperity that came in the wake of the warming climate and the increase in agriculture, they were able to begin this amazing enterprise of cathedral building, which required the mobilization of literally hundreds of thousands of craftsmen throughout Europe that had to be employed to build approximately 80 of the great cathedrals and about 500 of the smaller abbeys. And this required an enormous mobilization of social resources and a tremendous amount of wealth, because all of these people, the stone cutters, the carvers, the sculptors, the glaziers, the carpenters, the astronomers, all of these people had to be fed, they had to be paid somehow. And so it required this accumulation of wealth that did not exist during the Dark Ages. And so it was during this period of sustained prosperity that lasted up until the early 1300s that we see the Grail literature emerge. Now, the Grail literature itself refers us back to this period at the beginning of the Dark Ages, and it's all revolves around the enterprise of the quest for the Grail. And what happens in most of the stories, the theme is the same, the characters are interchangeable, but the general themes are the same, is that the kingdom had fallen into decline simultaneously with the king. Now, the king in some cases might have been Arthur, in other cases it might have been Bran, in other cases it might have been Anfortas, in others he was simply called the Fisher King, but in all cases he had gone into was suffering some kind of debility. In some cases it was a sickness, in other cases it was a wound that wouldn't heal, but simultaneously with that, the kingdom itself had gone into a state of debility. And so the quest for the Grail was the seeking of the instrument or the agency by which the health could be restored to the king, but not only to the king, but to the land itself. And for those of you who might have seen the movie of John Borman's Treatment, at the end, when Percival finally finds the Grail after years and years of questing, and he finds out what the secret of the Grail is, how many of you remember what the secret of the Grail was? What? George?
I missed it.
You missed it. Okay. The king and the land are one. The king and the land are one. Now that's a very interesting proposition. And the idea there is that there was this continuum, this linkage between the kingdom, between the land and between the king. And when the land became debilitated, so did the king, or vice versa. See? So the Grail not only was about restoring the king, it was about restoring the kingdom, about restoring the land, which had fallen into decline. And what we now know is that the land literally fell into decline for several centuries. That was what the Dark Ages was. And so the stories of the quest are set in Arthurian times. Now, most of the references to King Arthur suggest that he was killed in the Battle of Camlan, or Camlan, when he fought his bastard son Mordred, right? That event is usually placed at around 540 AD. So what's interesting is that the quest is set right in that epoch when we know that something happened in the northern hemisphere that caused this climatic decline, that caused this darkness to come over the world. It's almost as if the world for a while became enshrouded. I will be pulling up some, maybe not tonight, but at some point I'll be pulling up some of these accounts, some of these historical accounts where various monks and chroniclers are talking about the conditions, the environmental conditions, and they're clearly describing something that is quite unusual. They're talking about the cold and the damp and the dark, etc., etc. So the Grail material emerged historically during this period, 1180 to 1230 AD, in that half century. But it refers back as setting as back in this period around 540 AD. Got it? Okay. Okay, then he goes on to say, besides the romances listed, there are numerous medieval translations of French texts into other languages: Norse, Irish, Welsh, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Dutch. The total bulk of the Grail romances produced before the Renaissance was prodigious. It is noteworthy, however, that all the basic texts listed above were composed within a period of about 50 years. The earliest Chrétien's poem was written about 1180. So, what we come up with here is this, to me, amazing time during history when all of this stuff was going on. The cathedral building, the troubadours, the Templars, the Cathars, the Grail material, all coming in. I don't think this was all just accidental. I think this was part of, well, almost a conspiracy, if you will, to reveal some of this information to the world at large. And this is why in many of the cathedral depictions where you see Jesus as the master teacher seated between the vessel of the fish, the mandorla, or the vessel of piscus, he's shown there and he's holding in the book is open. Because what they're doing is they're saying we're opening the ancient doctrine, the archaic teaching, and making it available to a wider audience. And I think that was a big part of what that whole period was about. What we see then is that, interestingly, that period, which is now climatologists refer to this period as the MWP, the medieval warm period. And it was during this time that you had colonists going and establishing communities on Iceland. You had Scandinavians going all the way to Greenland and establishing communities on the west coast of Greenland. And this was what was happening in that period from roughly 950 AD up until about 1300 AD. And what happened around 1300 AD is the beginning of the Little Ice Age, the LIA, the Little Ice Age. If you look in the literature, it's usually abbreviated LIA. What happened in the Little Ice Age? Well, the climate cooled again. And during the medieval warm period, pack ice that had come down from the Arctic Circle had receded way back and it opened the sea lanes. This is why the Scandinavians were able to sail from Europe all the way to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland. And it was during this period of time that they were actually able to farm on the west coast of Greenland, where it is now perennially frozen ground. Okay, now come about 1300. Actually, it can be pinpointed right to around 1315 to 1320. The cold started coming back into the world, and it was the first phase of the Little Ice Age. And the sea ice began to move south again. And what happened is it choked off the sea lanes, and it cut off communication, first between Greenland and Iceland, then between Iceland and the European mainland. The Greenland colonies went completely extinct. It took about a century or century and a half for them to ultimately fail completely. But with the persistence of the cold of the Little Ice Age, it eventually became impossible. And in the reconstructions of what might have happened to that Greenland colony, it was apparent that they had multiple year crop failures, agriculture collapse. They weren't able to grow the hay to feed the crops and the livestock, and then they eventually ate all the livestock. And by the time that they had felt that they thought they were going to be able to recoup, the sea ice had basically come south, closed them off from Europe, and they weren't able to get supplies from Europe. They weren't able to evacuate Greenland to get back to Europe, and so they basically died off. Iceland almost went the same route, but it became nearly unpopulated at the time, but they were able to hang in and recover because Iceland was a little bit more accessible from mainland Europe. So in any case, what happened is we see that there was a series throughout Europe of agricultural collapses and crop failures, which almost like a repeat scenario of what happened around 540. And then you had the bubonic plague that came in, sort of as the coup de grace. After starvation and famine, you then had the plague, and then once again, about a third of the population of Europe died off in the plague. And so you had a period that, and what you see then is that the Gothic cathedrals, that was this amazing wave of activity that was going on suddenly stopped. And that's why there's so many of those cathedrals that are not finished, is because suddenly there's no food to feed the craftsmen, right? And people are dying. There's no labor force anymore. So what they did was they were able to essentially make hay while the sun shined. You know, while you had the MWP, the medieval warm period, they were able to grow wealthy and build the cathedrals and do all of this amazing stuff. And then the cold came back into the world. And so what we see, though, is that it then took, a century or two before European civilization was able to recover from that onset. The recovery actually occurred because the Little Ice Age was in two phases. And right around in the middle of that, there was a warming spell that lasted for about 75 or 100 years. And this allowed European civilization to recover to some extent, so that it had prospered enough that when the second phase of the Little Ice Age came in, they had enough momentum that they were able to weather it much better. Interestingly, the Little Ice Age only came to an end, generally, according to all of the records, both historical, geological, paleoclimatological records, show that it only came to an end around 1850. So it's important when we start talking about modern climate change and global warming and all this to have this context to realize that the second phase of the Little Ice Age was the coldest time on planet Earth in 10,000 years. In 10,000 years, the glaciers began to grow, and they grew enormously during this time. Not, of course, anywhere near the extent that they had been during the Great Ice Age, but they grew to where basically anybody who has studied the glaciers and glacier growth will say that, yeah, these glaciers during the end of the Little Ice Age had grown bigger than they had been in 10 or 12,000 years. So when we talk about glacier recession, it's important to understand what our baseline is. Okay, now I'm describing all this as a context to try to understand here how the Grail fits into all of this. See, so we had a period of darkness and cold that came on the planet. We then had that terminated by this period of warmth. This period of warmth allowed European society to prosper. During this prosperous time is when we had all of this amazing stuff going on, and then the cold came back and it all came to an end for a short period of time. Now, what is the Grail itself talking about? Well, the Grail, I'm suggesting, actually is referring to what I think of as a lost technology, which literally is about restoring fertility to a landscape that has been devastated by these events. And so that's what we're going to kind of get into. Let's continue on here with some of these interesting quotes from some of the writers. Again, Roger Sherman Loomis, who's one of my favorite Grail scholars, he wrote this way back in 1963. He said, "No legend of the Middle Ages, except those endorsed by the Church, has had so strong an evocative and provocative power as the strange fictions which grew up about the Grail. Thanks to Tennyson and Wagner, Galahad and Parsifal have become types of chastity, and the quest of the mysterious vessel has come to mean, on the one hand, a vain following after wandering fires, or on the other, the arduous search for supreme mystical experience. It is not strange that the medieval legends should have engendered in our century so diverse an offspring, for they form a bewildering assortment of battle and banquet, earthly magic and sacramental miracle, blood feuds and mysterious rites. Bewilderment begets curiosity and seeks a solution. And over the last 100 years, scholars and would-be scholars, such as myself, have tried to discover the secrets of the Grail with such contrasting results that the reading public, eager for enlightenment, may well feel more puzzled than ever. The quest of the Grail has led to the Punjab in India, to the palace of Atreus at Mycenae, and the temple of Zeus at Dodona, to the monastery of Montserrat in Spain, to the palace of Chosroes in Persia, and the Christian shrines of Constantinople. Pick up a book on the subject, and you may be told with a great show of erudition that the object itself was derived from the cauldron of the Irish god Dagda, from the eye of the Egyptian god Tehot, from a symbol of the female organ of generation, from a pearl of the Zoroastrian cult named Gohar, from a talisman of the heretical Albigensians, who were basically the same as the Cathars, once adored in a cavern of the Pyrenees, or from a great sapphire, formerly preserved in the sacristy of Glastonbury Abbey. So all of these places have been one way or another associated with the Grail. Glastonbury Abbey, the Pyrenees, the great sapphire. All of these images are things that scholars have derived from reading through this Grail material. So it's not just simply to say, oh, it's this cup. You drink from the cup and that's it. Because all of the Grail writers describe it in different terms. See? And that's one of the reasons that it has ended up being so complex and so confusing to the lay public. Reading this, trying to make sense out of it all. If you immerse yourself into this literature, it comes out very involved. He goes on to say that not all these speculations are as fatuous and incredible as they seem, and some find their excuse, if not their justification, in the diversity and the contradictions of the medieval texts themselves. For in them, too, there is a strange disagreement. The Grail may be described as the dish from which Christ ate the Passover lamb at the Last Supper, or as the chalice of the first sacrament. Now, one of the things you're probably all familiar with is this idea of the Last Supper that happened on the eve of the crucifixion, and they ate the Passover lamb, and the drank from the cup, and Jesus says, this is the blood of my blood, etc., etc. And they all drank from this cup, and then after the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea, who was considered by some scholars to maybe have been the uncle of Jesus, went and recovered his body off the cross and received the blood that was flowing from his side into the cup, right? Then after a series of adventures where he was imprisoned and miraculously escaped, he eventually made his way to Marseille, France, along with Mary Magdalene. According to the legend, she remained behind at Marseille, and he went on to England, where he met up with Arviragus, who was a pagan chieftain. Arviragus, and he was accompanied by 12 monks or disciples, so there was a total of 13 of them. So Joseph of Arimathea arrives in Glastonbury, presents himself to the pagan chief Arviragus, and Arviragus says, I'm going to give you a place to build a temple, or to build a church. and he gives him 120 hides of land, right? And what is a hide of land? A hide of land was considered to be the amount of land that was necessary to support one family. So it was, and then it became standardized at 120 acres, right? So Arviragus gave Joseph of Arimathea 120 acres that was going to be the sacred precinct, right? 120 acres, 12 hides of 120 acres each. Okay, so do that math. What's 12 times 12? 144. Add a 0 after that, so you get 1,440 acres, right? Now, this is a very interesting size for a piece of land, right? At the center of this, Joseph of Arimathea built a small, round, circular church out of wattles, which is basically plant material like vines that can be bent. And they built this small circular church. They set up 12 huts in a circle around it. Now, that maybe a century or two later, somebody came along in the aftermath and encased the original wattle church in lead to preserve it to some extent. Just prior to the beginning of the Dark Ages, somebody came along and actually replaced it with a building whose foundations were carefully designed to be the same size as the original wattle church, right? Now, around 1000 AD, an abbey was built there. It burned down about a century and a half later, and the abbey, whose ruins are now at the site, was now built to replace it. The ruins that are there now have a chapel at the west end called St. Mary's Chapel. St. Mary's Chapel has been very carefully measured by Bly Bond, who was an ecclesiastical architect around the turn of the century. Now, the interesting thing about St. Mary's Chapel is this. It was built, it's a rectangular small chapel, and this is what's there now. And this is the ruins of the abbey that was built in the 1100s. This is St. Mary's Chapel right here. And here is the reconstructed ground plan of the original chapel, or the original abbey, and here's St. Mary's Chapel right here. Now, the interesting thing about St. Mary's Chapel is each time there was a reconstruction, they went to great lengths to preserve the dimensions of the original wattle church, the original wattle hut, right? So when they built this chapel right here, it was built to carefully preserve the foundation dimensions of the previous abbey. When the previous abbey was built, it was constructed in such a way to carefully preserve the original dimensions, right? Now, Bly Bond came along and did the whole analysis of this and the survey of this, came up and came to realize that the whole thing had been laid out on a grid with squares of 74 feet on the side. St. Mary's Chapel turned out to be 68.6 feet long and 39.6 feet wide this way. So 39.6 this way, 68.6 this way. Well, for anybody who's ever studied sacred geometry, that brings us to a very important ratio that's found throughout sacred geometry, and it's the ratio of the vesica, the preeminent feminine symbol, which is the symbol that we find Jesus seated in the portals of all these great Gothic cathedrals, right? Because it's based on the square root of 3. And if you actually do the numbers, divide, if any of you got a calculator in your laptop, if you do, divide 68, Brad, here, I can catch it. Okay, I'm going to put in 68.6. Can you see that? 68.6. And I'm going to divide it by 39.6. And what, can you read what that says? Can you?
17.
1 point.
Oh, I'm sorry. 1.732323.
1.732 is close enough. 1.732 is the ratio of the length to the width of a vesica. See? So they incorporated that symbolism, that mathematical symbolism, into the dimensions of St. Mary's Chapel. That was not an accident, you see. Now, there's something else that's very interesting about that particular rectangle. We study that rectangle in depth in sacred geometry classes because it has a very unique property called dynamic symmetry. It has a way of reproducing infinite replicas of itself through simple geometrical steps. There's a small family of these rectangles in these proportions that are based upon irrational numbers, such as the square root of 3. If you see this number right here, the one you just looked at, I'm going to hit this x squared button to square that, and basically, in round numbers, what is it?
3.
3. Yeah, so you take that ratio, multiply it times itself, and you get 3, because that number is the square root of 3. Now, in the great Gothic architecture, what you find is that the square root of 3 was one of the key proportions used to lay out the great sacred structures. The medieval Freemasons called it the system of ad triangulum, or of the triangle, because if you take one equilateral triangle like this and another one like this, and you put them together base to base, its length to width ratio is going to be the square root of 3, you see. So in sacred geometry, that's one of the very first exercise we do in sacred geometry is the creation of this vesica. And it's created by means of two circles that are overlaid on one another such that the circumference of one falls on the center of the other. If you have one circle in its center, you take a second circle of the same diameter and draw it in such a way that its circumference hits the center of the first one, and vice versa. It's the overlap of those two circles that creates this vesica. And that was the primordial act, if you will. And it was considered philosophically to be like a recapitulation of the primordial act of creation itself. Is the emergence of these two circles, these two symbolical circles. They come together and they merge until circumference lines up with center. And in that overlap, that vesica, out of that vesica, which is considered again like this preeminent feminine symbol associated with the womb, is born the whole edifice of Euclidean geometry, which emerges from that symbol. And it starts with the creation of the equilateral triangle in there. And then from there, a couple of additional simple steps, you can create a square, and that leads you into the ad quadratum system of Masonic geometry, which means of the square. And as the vesica is based upon length to width ratio square root of 3, all squares, their diagonal to their side length is the ratio of square root of 2 to 3. Now the square root of 2, the square root of 3, the square root of 5 are like the phi ratio, the golden section, or pi, in that they are non-repeating, non-terminating decimals. They go on and on and on, and they never repeat and they never terminate. This is why they're called irrational. Sometimes they've been referred to as transcendental numbers, but in any case, these numbers are like that. So what we find at the very beginning here is we have this circle. It's 39.6 feet. Now, there's kind of a coincidence here because we say that the sacred precinct was 1,440 acres, right? Now, who's good with a calculator? Nobody? Are you pretty good with a calculator, Tim? All right. What you're going to do is you're going to put in the number 1,440. Okay, now let's talk about an acre. What is an acre?
440 feet on the side.
How much?
440.
43,560.
It's an acre is 1/640th of a square mile. So 640 square acres equals 1 square mile. Okay, so it'll turn out that a square acre, if you quickly in your head take a mile, which is 5,280 feet, square it, right? Divide by 640, you'll get 43,560, I believe. Isn't that right? Okay, so that's the number of square feet in an acre, right? Now, you got 1,440 in your calculator, multiplied by 43,560. You're going to get a big old number, right? Now that's the number of square feet in the sacred precinct at Glastonbury as laid down by Joseph of Arimathea and his 12 followers. Now, to try to get a handle on what that size is, that's the total number of square feet. What we want to do now is take the square root of that number, and it'll give us the length of that square on the side.
7920.
7,920. What's that? It's the number of miles in the diameter of the Earth. So we have an interesting ratio here. What we now have is a proportion. A proportion is that when two ratios are equal. On the one hand, we have a square with a sacred precinct. If we were to draw a circle in there whose diameter exactly filled the square of the sacred precinct, it would be a circle 7,920 feet in diameter. So that circle to the foot is proportional to the Earth to the mile. See? Is that a coincidence? Or is that part of some deliberate scheme of geometry that was worked into this? Now, if you turn to the book of Revelations, the final, I think it's the second to the final chapter, it describes, no, it is the final chapter, I believe, the holy city. It says, John goes into this visionary state. He's the angel comes and takes him to the great and high mountain, and then reveals to him the vision of the holy city. And he says he sees the holy city descending out of heaven, from God out of heaven. And he describes the holy city and says that the holy city lieth foursquare, and the length and the height and the breadth of it are equal 12,000 furlongs. 12,000 furlongs on a side. Okay, now how much is a furlong? Do we have any horse racing aficionados in here? Anybody who likes to gamble at the track? George, you get no? That's the one place where furlongs are still used. Okay. In horse racing. And it's an old English unit of measurement. And it was used in the Bible in the King James English in place of the word stade or stadia, which was in the original Greek, because the stade and the furlong were considered to be counterparts of one another. So when King James had the translation done in the 1600s, they used the word furlong, which was this ancient British unit of measurement. A furlong is 1/8 of a mile. So 8 furlongs equals 1 mile. Now, Tim, put in 5,280 in the calculator, the number of feet in a mile, and divide by 8. And we'll have the number of feet in a furlong. 660 feet in a furlong, right? Now, let's make this even a little more precise. How many inches are there in a furlong? So you simply go 660 times 12.
7,920.
7,920. There it is again. Now what we're getting here is a continuous proportion. We have the furlong to the inch is the same as the Glastonbury sacred precinct to the foot, which is the same as the Earth to the mile. Now, is this coincidental? Maybe. But if it's a coincidence, it's a pretty strange coincidence, isn't it? Now, think about this. If we were to take a measuring tape, and I have actually not, I didn't take my truck tonight, but if I had taken my truck, I have 150-foot fiberglass tape I always carry around in my truck. If I went and I measured out a furlong on the street or a parking lot or something, and I have actually done this, 660 feet. And then I was to take my thumb, and most thumbs, if you press them down, are 1 inch wide, right? This is where we get the inch from, by the way, just like this is where we get the foot from. And where do we get the mile from? Mile originally comes from the word mil, which means in Latin what? 1,000. So 1,000 what? This. 1, 2, 3. If I'm pacing and I do 1,000 paces, that's going to give me a mile, more or less. I'm going to have a longer mile because I'm 6'1". I think if you're about 5'9", your pace is going to be just about right that 1,000 of them will give you a mile of 5,280 feet. But in either case, what we have here is a ratio between the pace and the foot, 5.28, right? And you take 1,000 of those, and now you've got a mile, right? So now if we take the Earth, next to 1,000 paces, it's the same as the furlong is to an inch. Now that's very interesting because this takes us into a concept from sacred geometry. Because what sacred geometry is about is studying these linkages between these various scales, these various domains, and leads us into a concept called scale invariance, which basically tells us that regardless of the scale, the proportional relationships remain the same. And I think this is what we were finding embedded in the book of Revelation, and it's also found in the legend of the Grail. And Joseph going to Glastonbury and establishing this sacred precinct, so on the one hand we have the furlong to the width of the thumb, which is where the inch comes from. Then we have the sacred precinct to the foot, right? And then we have the earth to the mile, which is 1,000 human paces. So in each case, what it's referring us back to is some unit of measurement that's ultimately derived from the human proportion. And this is why I think Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. See? And I think what they're trying to show us here is that built into the very geometry of our own human anatomy are the cosmic proportions. And what we do is when we extrapolate from that, what we're looking for is the geometric mean between various scales of phenomena. So on the one hand, once we're talking about the earth, now we're getting into really the cosmic level, right? But what the temple was, what the cathedral was, what the holy structure was to create a geometric mean between two scales, the human scale and the terrestrial scale. You see? And by creating a geometric mean between these scales, you create the potential for resonance, which I believe is one of the fundamental processes at the basis of what I think of as the Grail technology, resonance. And that's why I elaborated upon this whole phenomenon of these interesting proportional relationships. I said that the mile is 1,000 human paces of 5.28 feet each, right? So this is a proportion that's built into the dimensions of the human itself. The human geometry gives us that proportion of 5.28. And because of the fact that, for example, if you're a smaller person, your mile might be shorter than 5,280. If you're a large person, it might be greater. But the proportion between your pace and your foot is going to remain relatively constant at about 5.28 feet, right? Now, you've got, in that calculator, Tim, you had the diameter of the earth. Put 7,920 in there. That's the diameter of the earth. Now, we said that the holy city was described as 12,000 furlongs on a side, right? So if you go 12,000 times 660, in fact, erase the 7920 and do this. Go 12,000 times 660, the number of feet in a furlong, to see really what are they describing there. How many feet did you come up with?
7,920,000.
7,920,000. There's that 7920 with just 3 zeros added after it. Now do this. To make that manageable, since nobody can really picture what 7,920,000 feet is, divide that by 5,280 to convert it to miles.
1,500.
1,500 miles. What are they talking about there? I'm not sure. I have a suspicion, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But notice something. What I want you to do, you got that number 1,500 in there? I want you to divide that by the number of the number of miles in the diameter of the earth. So you got 1,500 divide by 7,920. And you're going to get some number less than 1, aren't you?
Yeah.
Now what we want to do is we're going to flip that over. So what you've got now is the holy city on top, the earth on the bottom. We're going to flip that, put the earth on top, the bigger one on top, the smaller one on the bottom. So all you need to do, Tim, is hit the 1 over x key and tell me what you get.
5.28.
5.28. So there it is. Once again, that fundamental human proportion is built into this analogy here, you see. is this again coincidence? Well, what I've only shown you here is just the merest tip of the iceberg of this whole phenomenon. You see, it applies to pretty much everything. The sacred structures that were built all over the planet, whether you're talking about Mesoamerica, whether you're talking about King Solomon's Temple, whether you're talking about Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Glastonbury Abbey, whether you're talking about geometrical metaphors found in sacred writings such as the Book of Revelations, what we're discovering is that there's this consistent geometry, this scheme of geometry embedded in these things. What does it mean? Well, again, I think what it gets us back to is this idea of resonance. That there are these correlations between these disparate realms of phenomena. And they're correlated through number, through measure, through proportion. And in fact, you remember the story about the handwriting on the wall? Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharshin, something like that. My Hebrew is probably atrocious, but basically it translates as number, measure, and proportion. That's the handwriting on the wall. So these are examples of what I'm suggesting is resonance, this resonant phenomenon. And we've only explored just a few areas because what I'm trying to do is give you the general idea of it. So with that in mind, let's go back to talking about the Grail itself. And here is an image of Joseph, St. Joseph of Arimathea when he's arriving. And here's the Tor, which is this hill there that's near there. And of course what you see there is the Grail, and he's got the staff that he plants in the ground, and then it takes root and begins to blossom. So a miraculous staff. Okay, we'll go back to this image, the ground plan of Glastonbury Abbey. Now, what's interesting here, and this is what got Bly Bond, the ecclesiastical architect, into a lot of trouble, and actually ended up getting him kicked off. He had been commissioned by the Church of England to do this excavation. Well, he did. He came up with this and realized that the entire abbey was laid out, and he was an architect. So he realized that the entire abbey was laid out on this grid of 74 by 74 feet, right? Okay, 74 feet. Okay, and he realized that the whole thing was based on a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of these squares of 74 feet, right? Well, Tim, you've got the thing there, so then what's the total length of this grid system? 74 feet times 9 gives you what number, Tim?
666.
666. Now you can see why he got in trouble. They didn't want to hear about that. Because 666, we all know what that is, right? What is that, Bruce? The number of...
Yep.
Is it the devil? Well, it doesn't actually say it's the devil. It says, here is wisdom. Let him who hath understanding count the number of the beast. For it is the number of a man. 603 score and 6. So it doesn't really say it's the devil, does it? That's something that came later. It was assumed that you could easily exchange the devil with Lucifer, with the beast, with the Antichrist, and that all these things were just interchangeable, but they're not. They're all symbolical of forces in nature. And that's what you've got to understand here. We've got to strip these doctrines, these ancient doctrines of cosmic science, of the accretion of the superstition of the centuries, and get back and realize that underneath this, we're talking simply about forces of nature. Just out of curiosity, I don't remember, 74 times 12, how many inches is that?
88.
888. Now that's an interesting number. Because we had 666 feet for the full length. We have 888 in the inches is each square. Well, what's the significance of that number? Well, in the ancient Semitic languages, which are primarily Hebrew and Greek, but it also includes the Sanskrit, there was a system of substitution, a substitution cipher, whereby you could substitute a letter for a number. Because prior to the advent of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the Semitic languages used the same set of symbols both for the letters of the alphabet and for numbers, right? So in Hebrew, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daleth, He, Va, Zain, Het, Tet, Yud, Kof, Lamed, etc., you could count through, and it was a denary system. So Aleph was 1, Beta was 2, Gamma was Gimel, get my Greek and my Hebrew mixed up, but it was the same in both cases. You had units, tens, and hundreds. So the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Yud, which had the value of 10. The next letter was Kof, which had the value of 20. Lamed had the value of 30. Mem 40. Nun 50. Samek 60. Ayin 70, etc. Right through until you got to Ta or Tau or Tav at the end, which had 400. The Greek system worked the same way, right? Now, in Greek, the most important name in the New Testament is the name of Jesus, which is Jesus, which was spelled iota, epsilon, sigma, omicron, upsilon, sigma. And let's see if I can remember this. Iota was 10, so put in 10. Epsilon was 8, so put in 8.
Times or plus?
Plus, sorry, Tim. Sigma was 200, so put in 200. Sigma. Omicron was 70. Upsilon was 400. Upsilon, and the final sigma was 200. And then hit equals.
888.
What'd you get? Say it loud so everybody hears.
888.
888. Yeah. Coincidence? You know, at what point do you say, okay, this goes beyond coincidence? And somebody was actually trying to encode information. That each one of these squares on a side is 888 inches, and in the Greek spelling of Jesus, iota, epsilon, sigma, omicron, upsilon, sigma, the numbers add up to 888. So now you have the number of the beast and the number of Jesus encoded in this grid system. Coincidence? I don't know. Now, your skeptic and your rationalist, your reductionist is going to be, oh, you're just playing with numbers. And I've heard that before. Yeah, I am playing with numbers. But maybe the guys who designed us were also playing with numbers. And in fact, maybe God himself played with numbers. Himself. Because I think God transcends those kinds of distinctions. So anyways, we're confronted with some very interesting stuff here. Very interesting stuff. And I've just tried to show you a little bit of how it works. We have a correlation now between geometry and language. And we can go through the New Testament. We can find all kinds of examples of important names. If we take one of the key phrases that we see over and over again in the New Testament is Jesus, not only with Christos, Iesus Christos, but Kurios Iesus Christus. Kurios Iesus Christos. Kurios means Lord. Iesus means Jesus. Christos means Christ, right? And that's probably repeated dozens and dozens of times in the New Testament. Well, when you look at the word Kurios, Kurios has the value of 800. Kappa, upsilon, rho, iota, omicron, sigma. You don't need to do it. It's 800. Take my word for it. Christos, chi, rho, iota, sigma, tau, omicron, sigma. Christos had the value of 1480. Right? Now, if you still got 888 in your calculator, now go plus 800, plus 1440. And if my calculations are right, you'll get 3,168.
128.
I got 120.
What'd you get?
3,128.
Let's go again. Kurios, 800.
Instead of 1480.
Do it again. 800.
It's supposed to be 1480.
And what did I say?
1440.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm still locked in. 1480. That'll get it right. Thank you. So we've got 800 plus 888 plus 1480. Oh, sorry, Mike. What does that add up to?
3168.
3,168, right? Okay, now go back to the holy precinct at Glastonbury is 7,920 on the side. So do this. Go 7,920 to get the times 4 to get the full perimeter.
$31,680.
31,680. So there's that number. Shows up, but raised times 10, right? So we could go on and on and on with this. See, what does all this mean? Well, I think what we're getting at here is, again, back to this idea of resonance, that there's some kind of harmonics going on between these different levels of phenomena. And when we're talking about an inch, and this now for all of you that are taking these series of lectures, this is now going to be our secret sign, is when you see this, no longer is it just, it now has another dimension of meaning to it, right? Okay, or we can hold up our foot. So this idea of resonance shows us that, I think, is what we derive from this idea that there are these proportional relationships between these various phenomena. The human scale, the scale of the sacred temple or structure, and the cosmic scale that begins by the measure of the earth. Because if we were to measure the cosmos, how did they actually first do it? Well, you remember Eratosthenes, he was able to measure the size of the earth just simply by putting a pole in the ground and then measuring the angle of its shadow at the moment of summer solstice. The story goes that he was at Sais, Egypt, which is right now, in modern times, is approximately where the Aswan Dam is built. Eratosthenes was the librarian at the Library of Alexandria, which was roughly 500 miles further north. So what he was able to do was to put a pole in the ground at Alexandria and measure the shadow, which was 7.5 degrees of the sun at summer solstice, right? When he went 500 miles to the south, so the story goes, there was a deep well in the middle of town, and at summer solstice, because Sais was 23.5 degrees north of the equator, at noon on summer solstice, the sun was exactly perpendicular, or at the zenith of the position of Sais. So the sun shined down, and only on that day could the sun be seen reflecting from the water at the bottom of this deep vertical well shaft. So he was smart enough to figure out that, well, if it's vertical here, and you go 500 miles north on this sphere, and it's a 7.5 degree angle, the total sphere is going to be 360 degrees, so he divided 7.5 into 360 and got roughly 50, knew that it was 500 miles because he'd made the journey multiple times, 500 times 50, and he got 25,000 miles for the diameter of the Earth. And that's an exercise we actually do in the sacred geometry class with graphics and compasses and everything, so we can see exactly how it works.
When was that?
When was that? It was about 500 BC, somewhere around that time. 300 to 500 BC in that window. I've forgotten the exact date. Okay, so now, once you have the circumference of the Earth, divide that by pi, and this is where you can get the diameter. That we're using the number 7,920. Now, here's what he was able to do, or what subsequent smart guys were able to do, is that if you go, and for example, you look at the sun at one moment, the moment of sunrise, and you can actually measure it against a distant star, and you wait 12 hours, and you take a second observation, what's going to happen 12 hours later? Well, the Earth is going to have turned 180 degrees on its axis, so now you can now look at that same object, and what you've done is you've got a triangle whose base is 7,920 miles. And see, by triangulating that way is how they were originally able to calculate the distance to the sun. Now, once you have the distance to the sun, See, knowing the diameter of the Earth, you can use that to get the distance to the sun through careful observations. Once you've got the distance to the sun, you can do essentially the same kind of process. Now, you know that if we take an observation on, say, fall equinox, and then we do again, and let's say we've discovered that the distance to the sun is roughly 93 million miles, right? So now we take an observation at, say, spring equinox, one of the equinoxes, of the sun against a distant star. And that's a tricky thing to do, but it can be done. Now you wait 6 months. What's going to happen? The Earth is over here now, isn't it? It's going to be 93 million times 2, or 186 million miles. So now you have a triangle whose base is 186 million, and you can again triangulate against a distant star, and you can now begin, you see, to get a sense of the scale of the universe. But see, it starts, and this is something that I've done several times in the sacred geometry classes, is go through this process and take, the rudiments of trigonometry are what you need, and it's very simple stuff to do that triangulation calculation. But what's interesting is you can actually begin to get a sense of the enormity of the universe itself, or the cosmos itself, by starting by making 2 observations of just poles stuck in the ground and measuring the shadow cast by the sun like 2 different times of the year or 2 different places. Okay, so I deviated there somewhat, but still this is all kind of a context for understanding this whole Grail phenomena that we're talking about here. So this is a reconstruction of what the original abbey that is now in ruins would have looked like, and this would have been St. Mary's Chapel right here, based upon the proportions of the Vesica. Now, something else that's interesting that we'll see here, I said that the dimensions of St. Mary's Chapel were 39.6 feet wide and 68.6 feet long. Tim, if you would pick up that calculator again and go 39.6 and multiply that times 2 and see what you get.
79.2.
79.2. Think about that number that we just came up with. You see, so if you take the diameter of the Earth at 7,920, and if you were God setting out your compass to draw the template for the Earth, you're going to set your compass at 3,960 miles, right? Now, the width of St. Mary's Chapel is 39.6 feet. Again, coincidence? Maybe. But at what point, how many of these correlations does it take before you say, okay, this is intent, this is pattern, this is not coincidence anymore? Well, this was another famous site associated with the Grail, the Castle Montsegur, or the Mount of Salvation. This is in southern France, site of one of the last massacres of the Cathars in 1244 AD. Now, this particular place, like it says here, was one of the very last. And in '89, I climbed that to get up there so that I could actually take this picture here of my feet. But the story goes, and apparently it's been authenticated, is that there was about 200 and some Cathars, and majority of them were actually women, and there were quite a number, at least several dozen children, but there were also some Templar Knights there as well, because a number of the Templar Knights were trying to actually protect the Cathars from the pogroms of the church, because they were declared a heresy, and the Inquisition was established to suppress the Cathar heresy, because the Cathars, and in fact some scholars who have studied the Cathars have said that basically the advance of Western civilization was retarded by 2 or 3 centuries at least by the suppression of the Cathars, because they were so advanced in their understanding of equality and healing and their social experimentation that they were doing was ahead of its time. And the Cathars taught that one could actually, that the pathway to God was an individual thing, and it could be accomplished without going through the authoritarian hierarchy of the church. And of course, this was the worst heresy of all and had to be suppressed. So there was one, you've all heard probably the famous saying, kill them all and let God sort them out. Well, that had its origins in the destruction of the southern French city of Béziers when I forget his name, but he was the Bishop de Montfort, if I remember right, was leading that particular pogrom. And one of the mercenary knights that he had been hired goes up and says, "Okay, no, we're going to go into the village and we're going to, execute the heretics, but how do we know which ones are heretics?" And he says, "Kill them all, God will know his own." So they went in there and basically put to sword 50,000 inhabitants, every inhabitant of the village. And then the reports of it said, the streets were running with blood, up to people's ankles, because there were so many of heretics being hacked to death. Anyways, the last holdout was here, or one of the very last holdouts. And there was a siege that went on for 9 months. They surrounded Mount Segur for 9 months, 10,000 of these mercenary knights that had been hired and forgiven of all their sins in advance. And also told that in addition to that, any plunder you get can be your own. So, they had a lot of takers on that, and since their sins were being forgiven in advance. So they surrounded the mountain for about 9 months, and then at the end of 9 months, finally the Cathars at the top holdout were pretty much at the end of the rope, and they agreed to surrender, but they wanted like 2 or 3 extra days. And the night before the surrender, 4 Templars went over the sheer side of the mountain in the middle of the night, carrying something with them. And they disappeared into the Pyrenees Mountains, and nobody knows what happened to them or what it was that they were carrying with them. Some suspect it might have been, what, the very thing we're talking about here. In any case, the next morning, the 200 and some Cathars came down, they surrendered, they were herded into a stockade and burned alive. And that was pretty much most of the end of the heresy. Here's a painting showing Arthur battling Mordred at the Battle of Camlan, which was the final climactic battle that basically ended the days of Camelot and essentially brought on the Dark Ages. I suggest a possibility that what this actually represents is a cosmic battle, if you will. And see, this is one of the things that we're getting at in here with this whole Grail mythos, is that what we're really talking about here are cosmic events that have been encoded into the form of this quest for this Grail, whatever it is, this chalice. So let's look at some of the texts themselves. And now Percival, who is probably the most famous of the knights that actually recovered the Grail, you see, he was the son of a famous renowned knight who was killed in battle. And his mother, Queen Herzeloid, was so distraught over the death of her beloved husband and was very reluctant to have her son, Percival, grow up to follow in his father's footsteps. So what she did is, after the death of her husband, she retired to the wilderness and raised her son in complete separation from civilization and other people, did not tell him about his heritage. And so the boy grew up basically living in the wild. Percival grew up living close to nature. He became very excellent at throwing a spear and at hunting and stuff like this. And he was incredibly physically fit. He could run fast. He could climb trees, all of this. And just as he was coming into his young adulthood, he was out one day in a contingent of knights he encountered in the woods, and they were on their way to Camelot to join King Arthur. And he was so smitten by their armor and their horses and their bearing and their demeanor that he wanted to become one immediately. So he went and he told his mother that he wanted to go and follow after these knights and catch them and go to Camelot with them. And she did everything she could to persuade him not to, but in the end he went anyway. Now, just prior to this, she had a dream. right? A prophetic dream. And the dream is recounted in Wolfram's story. And it says, one noonday the lady lay in troubled sleep when a dreadful vision came to her. It seemed to her as though a shooting star, I've got it underlined because here is a critically important clue. A shooting star swept her to the upper air where a host of fiery thunderbolts assailed her, flying at her altogether so that her long tresses hissed and crackled with sparks. The thunder pealed with loud claps and showered down tears of fire. As she came to herself again, a griffin snatched at her right hand, whereat all was changed for her. For now she marveled at how she was mothering a serpent, which then rent her womb, and how a dragon sucked at her breasts and flew swiftly away and vanished from her sight. It had torn her heart from her body. Such terrors she had to behold. So I've underlined of the what I think are the key images here that you should try to get into your minds. And so I've made a list of them here. Shooting star, fiery thunderbolts, long tresses, tears of fire, a griffin. What is a griffin? Merv Griffin? No, not Merv Griffin. What is
head?
What?
Different head than Merv Griffin.
Yeah, I think so.
Lion, eagle.
A lion and eagle, yeah. That's basically it. Thanks, Fred. A combination of a lion and an eagle. Well, now, constellations, what are we talking about? Lion would be what? Leo. And an eagle would be what? Aquila, yes. Counterpart of Scorpio. And the reason it's a counterpart is because Aquila, the eagle, rises at the same time as Scorpio. So they mark the same time of the year. And it's the autumn sign, right? So many of these things, that you're going to see, these composite beasts that show up, they have a cosmical underlying meaning. Think about the Minotaur. What is the Minotaur a combination of? Man and bull, right? What constellations do you suppose are being suggested? Taurus and Aquarius, exactly. Yes. And I'm sure you can think of some others. The Sphinx, lion and man, right? Leo, Aquarius. So now when you read these myths and you read about these composite beasts, bear in mind that in many cases you might be looking at a cosmical connection there. Okay, a serpent, a womb as rent by the serpent, a dragon, and a heart torn from her body by the dragon. Okay, now, long tresses. That's an interesting one because I think that's a critically important clue. What would be the cosmic connection with long tresses?
Comet? A comet.
Very good. Did you hear what she said? The very word cometa means long tresses, long hair. That's literally what it means. And there, I'm suggesting, is an important clue to deciphering what all this is talking about. I think clearly a shooting star, that's pretty overt. Fiery thunderbolts. Well, all myths from all over the world talk about thunderbolts, right? American Indian myths talk about thunderbolts. Zeus is known for hurling his thunderbolts. You remember the myth of Phaeton, the son of Helios, who tried to drive the chariot of his father in the path of the zodiac, but the great steeds knew that there was a weak hand there, and so they deviated off the path of the zodiac and swept down by the earth and set the earth on fire. And at the last second before the earth was consumed in a cosmic conflagration, Zeus hurled his thunderbolt and struck Phaeton, and Phaeton crashed down to the earth into the river Eridanus. And his sisters, the Heliades, then wept over the place where he crashed to the earth. And according to some accounts, it was their tears that caused the great flood. So all of this stuff I'm suggesting has something behind it that is actually real. It's not just superstitious stuff that people made up because they were ignorant and had no clue as to how nature worked, but was based upon experiences, actual experiences of our ancestors. And of course, what is now emerging is actual hard scientific evidence of what happened in at least several cases in recent geological history, that Earth has encountered things from out there and has caused enormous consequences, perhaps even great floods. And in fact, in October, some of you know I went on a trip with the author Graham Hancock, and I took him, how many thousands of miles did we cover, Brad?
Over 3,000.
Over 3,000.
Weeks, yeah.
Yeah, zigzagging around the northern United States so that I could acquaint him with evidence for the Great Meltdown, as I call it, when the great ice sheet, 7 million cubic miles of ice over Canada, underwent this extraordinary, extreme, catastrophic melting event. And up until a few years ago, nobody really knew what could cause that much melting that fast until in 2007, a group of researchers discovered cosmic fingerprints right at that boundary where the big meltdown occurred.
You're not going to elaborate, you're going to keep us in the dark.
Pardon me?
You're not going to elaborate on
Oh
that?
yeah, absolutely I am. Absolutely I am. We'll be, we're all of these ideas and images and themes that we're getting into, we're going to come back to and revisit. And then we're going to be piecing them together as this series goes on. I think we're going to go probably 4 or 5 lectures before we can get to the whole thing and close the circle. So here are some of the images and associations of the Grail mythos. The chalice, cup, or cauldron, like the cauldron of Lugh or Lugh, was the Celtic version of it, in which universal medicines were cooked. Sometimes it's depicted as a platter or a plate. Sometimes it's depicted as a cup. Holy blood or sacred blood, because the word itself, sangral, has 2 ways of interpreting it, right? One would be sangreal, which is Holy Grail, but depending on where you split the word, it could be sangral, which means holy blood. And that's another component of this mystery, because what we're doing here is it's like we're looking at a complex technology, and where each of these lectures we're going to examine different sections of this, and then we're going to start putting it together to see, once it is put together, what the machine looks like, what the vehicle looks like, you see. So it's also so associated with the ritual of the crucifixion. It's sometimes depicted as a man's head swimming in a salver of blood, or a shallow dish filled with blood, and that would, of course, probably references to like the beheading of St. John. Okay, a quest for something hidden or lost. It's also associated with the fertility of the landscape. Wolfram, as we'll get to, we'll see a stone or a stone fallen from heaven, a sapphire stone, right? It's associated with the knights, with King Arthur, the Round Table, with the Templars. And in fact, it's almost certain that both Wolfram von Eschenbach and Robert Deberon were both Templars. So 2 of the preeminent Grail authors were almost certainly Templar knights. It's also associated with the idea of rejuvenation, restoration, universal medicine. It's associated with Joseph of Arimathea, with angels, with the Eye of Thoth, and with a bleeding lance. And we did that quote last week or last month, but it's probably worth revisiting, just because this is from Cretan. This is the earliest of the Grail stories, and this is after Percival now has finally found his way to the Castle Corbenic, which is where the Grail was being kept, right? And on his way there, he'd kind of gotten lost, was wandering around, and he came upon a lake, and there was a man fishing in a boat. And this, he finds out later, was the Fisher King. And it was really the king who was debilitated, and all he could do was fish. He couldn't really do much else. So anyways, the Fisher King tells him, which he doesn't know it's the Fisher King at the time, tells him how to get to the castle, and without being told, he would have never been able to find it. So he goes and he finds the castle. He's welcomed. He's brought into a great hall. He's seated on a sofa, and then while he's sitting there, they're brought sumptuous food and drink, and then the Grail procession starts. So Percival sat down beside the Lord, who paid him every honor. Within that hall of light from the burning candles was as bright as one could find in any castle. As they were speaking of one thing and another, a squire came forth from a chamber, gripping a white lance by the middle of its shaft. He passed between the fire and those seated upon the bed, and everyone in the hall saw the white lance with its white point, from whose tip there oozed a drop of blood. And this red drop flowed down to the squire's hand. The youth who had come there, and that being Percival, the youth, who had come there that night, observed this marvel, but refrained from asking how it came about. For he recalled the admonishment given by the gentleman who had knighted him, who taught and instructed him not to talk too much. So he was afraid that if he asked, they would consider him uncouth, so he did not ask. Then 2 other squires entered, holding in their hands candelabra of pure gold worked with enamel inlays. The young men carrying the candelabra were extremely handsome. In each of the candelabra there were at least 10 candles burning. A maiden accompanying the 2 young men was carrying a grail in her 2 hands. She was beautiful, noble, and richly attired. After she had entered the hall, carrying the grail, the room was so brightly illuminated that the candles lost their brilliance like stars. Important hint. When the sun rises or the moon, after her came another maiden carrying a silver platter. The grail which preceded was of fine, pure gold. So, this is what's known as the Grail procession. So what is this talking about? Now, first of all, you've got a great hall, right? Now, that's a symbol. What do you suppose it's a symbol of?
The Vesica?
The what?
Vesica?
Not exactly. We'll come back to that then. So then you have this procession. You have the white lance, right? With a drop of blood dripping from it. And then you have the maiden coming in with the grail. And as soon as she enters the grail, the light from the grail is so bright that they can't see the candles anymore. But the hint is that the candles are likened to stars. Now, if we're in a great hall and you've got candles that represent stars, what do you think the hall itself represents?
Cosmos.
Yes. Good, good. Now, what light could come in that blots out the stars?
The sun.
Could be, yes. But what else?
God.
Well, let me show you this image here. Here she is. This is, forget it'll come to me in a second. The artist's name, 19th century artist, carrying the grail, showing the light. But I want to show you another image here that to me is very close. What is this? Well, this is a 19th century illustration from Granville's Un Autre Monde, 1844. And what is it? Who is this? The woman with long tresses? Yes. Who?
Yeah, I hear.
Well, I know the long tresses. Look at this thing right here. The nucleus. An entourage accompanying. And here's the quote directly from Chrétien. Through a castle hall by a beautiful damsel, her may float through the air in Arthur's palace, veiled in white samite, floating through the air. Now, I'm suggesting here that this is the cosmic part of the cosmic counterpart to the whole Grail mythos. Mm-hmm. So, what is it about comets that would make one think that it would have anything to do with the Grail? Well, in The Dream of Queen Herzeloid, we also learned what were some of the other images that were associated with her dream.
Oh, yeah.
Dragon and
Serpent dragon. And what do we have here?
Serpents.
Serpent. Anybody ever visited Serpent Mound in Ohio? Field trip. Now, notice here, you've got this serpent effigy, you've got this coiled tail, winds around, you got a mouth, and what appears to be an elliptical shaped object, maybe an egg, in the serpent's mouth. It's clearly an ellipse. It's a very elegant ellipse. Now, what is the shape? What is the geometric shape of a comet orbit? It's an ellipse, isn't it? Yes, it is. Now,
Wait a minute, who created that?
we don't know. We don't know.
Is it a mountain?
No, it's a mound. Here it is from the ground.
Oh, okay.
You can see that may actually be Brad right there. Is that you, Brad? I think it is. I think we visited here twice. But you can see here, this is from the ground. And this next image,
Yeah.
let's see here. This is an aerial image, I think taken like in the 40s. And here you can see the egg, the ellipse right there, serpent's head winding over on this ridge. And you can see the ridge kind of winds around like this. Now what's very, very interesting about this is that the serpent here on the ridge basically recapitulates the ridge itself. The ridge itself is a great serpent in the landscape, and you can see the head of the serpent right here. And you have water coming here and here, so it meets right at the confluence of these two springs or streams. And this is something that we're going to find is consistent in all of these sacred sites over and over and over again, is the presence of water, the spring, or flowing water, right? And you can actually see that there looks like two eyes here on the serpent's head. Yeah, and when we went there the first time I think we were there, I had my kid with me, and he fell over this cliff. He got up completely unscathed, though. We were exploring this cave to see. It's not a deep cave, but you can see that the landscape itself and the serpent itself kind of recreates the pattern of the landscape itself. Now, there's a secret in the landscape that's very germane and relevant to what we're talking about here. Let's go back, way back in 1838, John Locke of the Ohio Geological Survey noted that near the join of Adams, Highland, and Pike counties, more geological formations could be seen in a small disturbed area than at any other locality in Ohio. The uniqueness of the region was also noted by Walter Bucher in 1933 and 1936, who mapped and described the area in a classical geological study. He ascribed the origin of the disturbance to endogenic processes and labeled it a cryptovolcanic structure after the Steinheim Basin, which is in Germany. This study sparked a debate as to the possibility of an exogenic origin or astrobleem, a debate that continues today. Endogenic means from within, exogenic means from without, right? So there was this disturbed area. And we go on to say here in another study, the Serpent Mound disturbance. They've now given it a name. They're calling it the Serpent Mound disturbance. Is nearly circular in plan with a slight north-south elongation and a diameter of between 4.5 and 5 miles. It covers approximately 16 square miles and formed between the late Mississippian and the Pleistocene. So that's a huge wide range. They don't really know when it formed. The broad threefold structural subdivision of Serpent Mound consisting of a central uplifted core an outer ring graben, which just means an outer ring, and an intermediate transitional area is an intricate part of other disturbances as well. 1,000 feet of uplift is estimated to have occurred here. The intermediate transition area, consisting of faulted and folded rock, have both concentric and radial orientations. Beyond the transition area occurs a series of doubly plunging, generally faulted synclines. A syncline means a down warping of the rock, like this. This is a syncline, this is an anticline, right? Syncline is a down warping of the rock, which is termed the outer ring graben. A graben is a structurally defined block of land down-thrown between parallel faults, sometimes associated with a rift valley. So what we have is this ring of down-faulted rocks, and in the middle we have this uplifted area, 1,000 feet, and it's called the disturbance, right? The Serpent Mound disturbance occurs within a complex regional geological setting. The disturbance lies near an inflection in the Precambrian, meaning very old rock, basement at the intersection of a northeast trending monocline. Now here's a monocline. So got this syncline, anticline, monocline. Okay? You learned some geology tonight. The northwest fault zone coincides, now this is important and I've got it underlined, gravity and aeromagnetic anomalies. So there's something unusual going on there, and it has to do with the fact that this disturbance has occurred there. A recent aeromagnetic anomaly map of southern Ohio shows that the Serpent Mound disturbance lies within a northwest trending anomaly. That's their term for it. Although the exact nature of this zone is uncertain, its coincidence with the fault zone suggests an inherent zone of crustal weakness. An inflection, point of inflection is the position at which a curve changes its direction of curvature from convex to concave. So we have this disturbed area, right? That's very unusual and has these unusual magnetic and gravity properties associated with it, right? So how did it get there? Exogenic. That has now been proven. Something from the cosmic deep hit the Earth at that point and created this unique geological region and created this ringed structure around the rim. And guess where? What some ancient unknown somebody's put on that rim. This great Serpent Mound. Coincidence? Or did somebody know something that maybe has been forgotten in the interim? So here we sit. Now you understand that this serpent in the landscape is part of this uplifted ring, you see. So the secret of the Grail is concealed in its etymology. Holy Grail comes from the Middle English Grail, taken from the Old French, which is a modification of Graal, taken from the Middle Latin, a modification of the stem of gradal or gradale, which means a plate, derived from the Latin crater, bowl, taken from the Greek, a modification of crater. So the very word Grail itself originally was a crater, which meant a plate, right? So how interesting is it that the word we use today to describe these great features in the surface of the Earth, where the cosmic and the terrestrial encountered each other, we used the original Latin term crater that was the original term for Grail itself. Are we talking about, is this a coincidence here? In Arthurian romance, the Grail castle was round, had a dome covered with blue sapphires, and was strewn with carbuncles that shone like the sun. If Arthur is simply another aspect of Lugh, Cuchulainn, etc., then his castle Camelot is also in the sky, just like Curoi's spinning fortress. The same would apply to the Grail castle, where the Grail, sometimes too bright to look at, floats through the air clothed in white samite. You see, now when we start looking at this Grail imagery, I think we can see that we've got a backdrop a context in which we can place it to begin to extract some meaning from it. We are already familiar with some, and this is from a book called The Celtic Gods, which came out in 2005. We're already familiar with such castles being metaphors for the sky. The alternatives in various stories are that the Grail can be borne through the hall of the Grail castle by a beautiful damsel, or alternatively, it can float through the air in Arthur's castle, clothed in white samite. Either way, we have a bright, veiled object which moves through the air in a castle that is, in fact, the sky. What veiled, fuzzy, bright object can move through the sky? See, I think we've got right here, we've peeled back the first layer of this mystery that's been waiting 800 years to be exposed to the light of day. And I think that this is going to provide us the clue that we need to unlock the rest of this mystery, the Grail mystery. So let's look at that again, just to reinforce this connection. And here is another scholarly work, which doesn't really, get into too much what we're talking about here, except for the fact that it's dealing with the link between the Arthurian myths and alchemy as it applied during the kingship of Edward IV. But in this particular work, he says something interesting. Another significant Arthurian image popular at the beginning of Edward's reign was the circle in its various manifestations, the wheel of fortune, the round table, and the philosopher's stone. Now stop right there for a second. The wheel of fortune, the round table. What is, in the cosmic sense, what would that be? The wheel of fortune, the round table, with 12 knights sitting around it. Come on. Yes, of course it is. Of course it is, yes. And the philosopher's stone. At the top of Illustrated Life of Edward IV, the crowned Edward sits on top of Fortune's wheel, which has been permanently halted. Edward at the top of the circle bears a strong similarity to images of Arthur at the top of the round table. The Grail can mean many things, but one of its associations is with the table of the Last Supper, which, according to legend, was at Glastonbury and transformed into Joseph of Arimathea's table created for the Grail knights, which he did at Glastonbury. See, when they arrived at Glastonbury, they created another table, a circular table this time, that was created specifically to set the Grail on, right? So now you have the Grail, the table of the Last Supper. You now have the table at Glastonbury, and the third table would be the famous round table, right? The round table at Winchester, described by Harding, can also be interpreted as an image of the philosopher's stone, for it represented a state of happiness that had been lost. He says, and he goes on to say, and this is a very routine, basically dry scholarly work on certain images associated with the Grail. He says another manifestation of the Grail and the philosopher's stone was the comet, the lance-shaped ray of light that could blight a land or bring salvation. Now, remember the procession, the Grail procession? The first thing that came through was the white lance, right? Such astrological phenomena were of interest to the alchemists, who provide the most intellectually productive link between Arthur and Edward through their formulation of the public image of these kings. Merlin, who guided the destinies of Uther Pendragon and Arthur, was regarded as the original founder of alchemy in Britain. So we're seeing this now, this cross-pollination or correlation between the Grail mythos and alchemy. Very important. One 15th century alchemical work was written in the form of instructions given by Merlin to his son. Another recipe for the elixir attributed to Merlin occurs in a collection of Ripley's letters and writings. Ripley was a famous alchemist. Merlin was also an astrologer who interpreted to Uther Pendragon at Stonehenge the significance of a comet with two tails, shaped like a dragon. Yeah. Which, he said, presaged the death of a king and the rebirth of a dynasty, a time of joy and bliss. And remember when I was talking about that period where the Grail mythos was set? Here's an example of Roger Wendover, medieval English historian. in the year of grace AD 541, there appeared a comet in Gaul so vast that the whole sky seemed on fire. In the same year, there dropped real blood from the clouds, and a dreadful mortality ensued. Remember the lance dripping blood? Now, here is something that I would suggest that all of you who have not read my series on the Grail into Oracle, read it. That's your homework assignment. Go back. Let Shirley hook you up with the old issues if you can, because I give all this back, and we're going to cover that in here. But if you read that series, it'll I think enrich your experience and your knowledge of what I'm trying to communicate to you here. So now coming into some hard science here. This is by Vern R. Oberbeck, etc., etc. This is impacts, tillites, and Gondwana land. What's a tillite? Tillite is a jumbled mix of rock and stones and clay and sand and earth, jumbled and mixed together, usually associated with glaciers. Because glaciers come across the landscape, they sweep stuff up, they jumble it all up, and when the glaciers melt back, they leave this jumbled mix of material left behind, and it's usually called till. Like, Till Eulenspiegel. You know who he was, right? Who was Till Eulenspiegel? You ever heard of the Merry Pranksters? You ever heard of look him up, Till Eulenspiegel and his Merry Pranks. That's where they got their name. Anyways, we won't go off on Till tonight. Other than that, for some strange reason, Till now becomes the word used to describe this jumble of chaotic material. And of course, Till Eulenspiegel, he was a prankster and basically left chaos in his wake. But in the end, see, he was the fool. See, he was the archetypical fool that everybody thought that they could take advantage of, and he was the trickster. In the end, he always outsmarted everybody. See, and I think actually in 4th grade, I read my first stories about Till Eulenspiegel, and from that day on, I was going to be
Inspired.
and I was inspired. Yes. Now, planetesimal impacts. What's a planetesimal? Well, a planetesimal is midway between like an asteroid and a planet. So roughly what size would we be talking about then for a...
Like Mercury.
Like Mercury, or maybe how many miles in diameter? What?
I meant Pluto. Since that was debatable.
Pluto, yeah. Mercury is a planet, right. Pluto is better. What else that came up in the context of our discussion tonight? Roughly what size could a planetesimal be? 12,000 furlongs? Right? Come on, guys. Okay. Planetesimal impacts played an important role in Earth history, the growth of planets, the origin of the Earth's moon, and in forming the topographic dichotomy on Mars. Comet and asteroid impacts produced major formations on the surface of the moon. Some of the major periods of lunar geologic history were defined by the formation of large craters and basins. Because the cratering rate on Earth was higher than that on the moon, even more extensive impact deposits must have formed here. Impacts could even have played a dominant role in crustal evolution. What we're going to find out is impacts, encounters of things between Earth and things from the sky, not only played the dominant role in crustal evolution, but in biological evolution as well, and was responsible for creating the hydrosphere. What is the hydrosphere? It's the totality of water in the surface of the Earth. It's the oceans, it's the rivers, it's the creeks, it's the groundwater, it's the totality of water in the surface of the Earth. Continental crustal plates are rigid and of high strength. Some mechanism is required to initiate continental breakup. Pressure relief that produces basaltic eruptions from an upper mantle site may result from impacts that easily penetrate the thin oceanic crust. We suggest that larger craters forming on the continents could also have initiated rifting as well as basalt eruptions. Impact craters are capable of removing entire sections of the Earth's crust and subjacent upper mantle. So they go on to say, Jones in 1987 combined theoretical calculations with knowledge of the dynamic tensile behavior of rock and concluded that the propagating shock wave associated with formation of impact craters larger than 24 kilometers would fracture the crust down to the MOHO. That's short for Mohovičić discontinuity. We suggest that prolonged impact cratering could have extensively fractured the lithosphere. The crustal fracturing from these impacts, as well as that from many more smaller ones, would have produced an extensive network of fracture weaknesses permeating the lithosphere. These fractures would have propagated vertically and radially. So get this picture now. Things from space impact the Earth. They cause a major amount of disruption, disturbance. They'll excavate craters, right? Bowl-shaped structures, and they can crack or fracture and create a whole series of fault lines, which are now zones of weakness within the crust, right? Now, what do you think could propagate along, what initially might come to mind is something that might propagate along those zones of weakness?
Fracking.
What?
Fracking.
Fracking. Well, fracking is the human way of creating zones of weakness, and this is nature's way. What might move? What might propagate? What might be one thing?
Water.
Water, yes. Yes, yes. Exactly. This is what's known as the Bushveld Igneous Complex. It's in Africa. You can see it's round, and there's actually a down-faulted ring graben surrounded by an uplift ringed graben. Now you know that term. Think of all the cool terms you can throw around now when you're at parties with your friends. Well, I was out exploring a down-faulted ring graben, and guess what I found? Okay, so this is the Bushveld Igneous Complex. Now, what is neat and cool about the Bushveld Igneous Complex? Well, it's this. Let's talk about unique exotic metals for a minute. Platinum in South Africa. Platinum was first used in jewelry by ancient populations of Egypt and pre-Inca civilizations in Central America. So now we have platinum being used by these ancient civilizations, right? Spaniards explored the pre-Inca sources where platinum-laced riverbeds. However, they considered the white metal to be a nuisance because it was impossible to melt it and separate it from gold. Indeed, the Spanish alchemists considered platinum to be unripe gold. They threw it back into the rivers to give it the opportunity to ripen. Now see this link between platinum, because it is quite frequently found in association with gold. And this idea, now we have the association with alchemy. We'll go on, we'll skip all of this for now. Some of this I can provide for those of you that want to get seriously into this. I can give you this as handouts, or if you get the video of it, I think hopefully it'll be of high res enough that you can read this stuff in detail off the videos. However, it's talking about in 1924, Andries Lombard, an eastern Bushveld farmer, found a white metal in hand-panned concentrates on his property. He sent samples to geologist Hans Merensky, who realized that Andries' platinum grains were larger than those usually reported. He goes on, he says, so he managed to identify a strike length of over 100 kilometers for two platinum deposits hosted by the Bushveld Igneous Complex. The Bushveld Igneous Complex is now known to be a 370 kilometer diameter saucer-like structure, the center of which is buried while its irregular eastern and western rims are exposed. Then, let's see, it says here like it's a layered igneous intrusion within the Earth's crust, which has been tilted and eroded and now outcrops around what appears to be the edge of a great geological basin. The Bushveld Igneous Complex contains some of the richest ore deposits on Earth. The reserves of PGMs, or platinum group metals, now you can add this to your vocabulary, PGMs. Platinum, palladium, osmium, iridium, rhodium, and ruthenium are the world's largest, and there are vast quantities of iron, tin, chromium, titanium, and vanadium. Then we get to this, and here's a geologist showing what the basic, demonstrating the shape of the Bushveld Igneous Complex. Now, aside from the cup, what was the other thing that, a what?
Plate.
A plate, yes, exactly. Yeah, and here's a map. New evidence for the impact origin of the Bushveld Complex, South Africa. So, the idea here is that these metals, the platinum group metals, the PGMs, are brought to Earth by extraterrestrial bodies. You've all heard of the famous dinosaur extinction, right? And what was theorized, now almost certainly proven to have been the main trigger for the extinction?
Comet.
A comet or an asteroid. And what was the initial fingerprint that clued the geologists way back in the late 70s to the fact that it was something cosmic? What was it the presence of? Anybody know?
Iridium.
Iridium. Who said that? You're right. Iridium. Did you know that, George?
I had forgotten that.
You had forgotten. Remember after when I told you that initially, I said, don't you ever dare to forget this? Okay. Iridium. And iridium is one of the PGMs. Iridium, platinum, ruthenium, palladium, osmium. Yes, these are the PGMs, the platinum group metals that are brought to Earth by cosmic objects. So, you've got this object coming in loaded with the PGMs, many times higher than you find in the crust of the Earth. It strikes the Earth, right? It fractures the crust, creates zones of weakness that are now exploited by what? Water. And what do you suppose that water is carrying now through the crust of the Earth?
PGM.
Are you beginning to get the picture? All right. What is it about the PGMs that are unique? Well,
Heavy.
what?
They're heavy.
Yes, amongst other things, yes. We'll get to this and then we'll leave off for tonight. This was work done in 1995, Electric Genes. This article was published in Scientific American. Chemist Thomas J. Mead and molecular biologist John F. Kayem have been exploring how electrons move in large molecules. Such processes underlie many important biological phenomena. For instance, the conversion of sunlight into plant food by the magnesium chlorophyll model depends on stimulation of electron movement through the chlorophyll by the incoming protons. Mead and Kayem's molecule of study was DNA. They devised a way of binding atoms of ruthenium, a heavy metal, they devised a way of binding atoms of ruthenium. And ruthenium is a member of what family?
PGM.
The PGMs. A heavy metal to ribose, one of the backbone components of the helical chains of DNA. Ruthenium atoms act like electrical connectors into and out of the molecule. They have the added virtue of neither disrupting nor distorting its overall shape, which is the basic definition of a catalyst, right? Although there has been a long history of using such metals to understand DNA, the ruthenium-ribose combination revealed something extraordinary. And there we will leave it for... What? Okay. One. The researchers examined the electrical properties of short lengths of double helix DNA in which there was a ruthenium atom at each end of one of the strands. Mead and Kayem estimated from earlier studies that a short single strand of DNA ought to conduct up to 100 electrons a second. Imagine their astonishment when they measured the rate of flow along the ruthenium-doped double helix. The current was up by a factor of more than 10,000 times, over 1 million electrons a second. It was as if the double helix was behaving like a piece of molecular wire, as if it was acting literally as a superconductor. Now, I think that's an important hint right there. And so, again, what I'm leading up to here is that I think that there is a lost ancient technology that has come down to us in various forms throughout the generations, throughout the centuries, in symbolical form, and one of the forms that it took was, and where it was encoded and expressed and preserved and transmitted, was through the Grail mythos. So there's a lot more to get into, and we'll save that for next month. All right, so that's it for tonight. Well, what do you think, George?
Well, I was just talking about,
You-
we had all kinds of things we were wondering about. One of the things he was gonna ask, do you have an idea what the event was around the 500 something AD?
Next week, right?
Yeah?
Yeah.
And where it took place, or?
Yes.
Next week.
Okay.
Next month.
A month, I mean.
Next month, George.
Next month, okay.
Next month.
All right.
Very trivial question, when you were spelling out the Greek letters for Jesus, it obviously had 6 letters instead of 5, the way they spell it?
Yes. Yes. Iota, epsilon, sigma, omicron, upsilon, sigma. 6 letters. Jesus. So it was not 5, it was 6 letters, yes.
How do you spell that?
In English, how would you kind
Yeah.
Well, it would be
Sort of.
I, which was the J. The letter I, iota, was also, they had no letter J
of?
in the Greek, which was 24 letters instead of 26.
Uh-huh.
So it was I, and then epsilon would have been the E, sigma was the S, omicron O, U, upsilon would have been the U, and then the final sigma. Yeah. Iota, epsilon, sigma, omicron, upsilon, sigma.
You're just adding an O.
What?
You're just sort of adding an O.
Yeah.
In the middle with it.
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, that was the original spelling in Greek. Not necessarily the spelling in Aramaic, but the spelling in Greek.
Do we know what the spelling was in Aramaic?
I don't know. That I
They
don't
would
know.
have translated that from Aramaic, right?
Probably, but Aramaic was the spoken language, and Greek was the written language of the New Testament, which I think was deliberately done because what happens is by translating it into Greek, you're basically you're kind of bringing in elements of Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Neoplatonism, after Plato, yeah. Because I think some of the authors of the New Testament probably were versed in Pythagorean methods and so forth. So I think there was a deliberate attempt, perhaps, to link the esoterica of the Judaic tradition along with the Greek tradition, and that's why Greek was used. Because first of all, the Greek does lend itself, and there's some interesting correlations between, like the Old Testament Hebrew, the Kabbalah. The gematria was the system of translating words as numbers. There's some interesting correlations between the Hebrew gematria and the Greek gematria. All kinds of fascinating stuff. So now, when you're looking at that, in the context of everything we've been talking about, here's the Grail, the cosmic cup. And here's the dove, right, the vehicle from heaven delivering the Eucharistic wafer. Now we have a possible meaning behind what is that Eucharistic wafer actually composed of, and it's being delivered into the cup. And now we've seen the streams of water flowing out of the cup to join the terrestrial waters. You see, this, I'm saying, is the hydrosphere. We looked at this slide last time. This is one of the pillars in Chartres Cathedral. And as it says here, the Phoenix dragons drinking from the Grail cup. Are they drinking the magic water? Imbibing the magical waters? And see, the pillar in Chartres Cathedral has its roots into the earth. And you know, all the pillars surround the sacred well down in the grotto at Chartres. I have a photograph of that, but not in this program. And remember, all of the sacred sites, what's one common feature of all the sacred sites? Water. A sacred spring, a sacred well, a confluence of streams, that kind of thing. Interestingly, at Chartres, when the Romans first arrived, in about 300 AD, I think it was, and discovered the crypt. You know what they found in the crypt, right? Well, a version of this. This is, of course, not the Black Madonna, which is almost certainly an effigy of Isis with the infant Horus. And what is interesting about it is that it is said that at the sacred well there, where the spring was bubbling up out of the earth, the living rock had been carved into the head of a serpent. And the Black Madonna had her foot on the head of that serpent. And in the context of everything we've been talking about, I think that's extremely interesting stuff.
Is there a connection with Rennes Chateau and there's a serpent there?
Where?
Rennes Chateau?
Yeah.
The serpent, I'm trying to think, there's a serpent connection there in the Magdalene Temple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the very first slide, well, not the very first one, but one of the very early ones, because this is, I took this in that church at Rennes Chateau. There it is, the Grail, prominently displayed to anybody who's alert. There it is, the symbol, like, hey, you're on a quest for the Grail? Well, there's some clues to be found at this place.
But there's something to do with the serpent.
Yeah, I don't have that in this particular show. This was in the cemetery. As it says here, the gate to the entrance to the cemetery in the churchyard at Rennes-le-Château, southern France, displays two Grail cups in the form of ciboriums. Skull and crossed bones are presented in association with an equal-armed Greek cross, symbol of the four ages of the world. What is a ciborium? It's any vessel designed to contain the consecrated bread or sacred wafers for the Eucharist. It's also from the Middle Latin canopy and Latin drinking cup in the Greek kiborion cup, but was also the Egyptian seed vessel. And I have that underscored because I think that's an important clue. And this would have been the form in which Joseph of Arimathea would have conveyed the holy blood to England. So, I am going to pack it up, but I'll show you one last image. This is from Alchemy. You'll notice here the two trees, the two alchemical trees. One, the sun, the solar influence, the lunar influence, coming down to the earth. And what do you see here? He holds this androgynous figure. You see this is the male half and the female half, united in one, holding the power of the sun, the power of the dragon. And then you'll notice here the circulating water, right? Flowing into the mouth of this two-headed dragon, flowing out of the mouth. And you'll notice right here, it's depicted as blood. Because we're seeing the analogy between the human form, human anatomy, and the terrestrial anatomy, is that the human blood has its counterpart in the earth in the subterranean streams of water, you see. And that's exactly what this alchemistical artist is trying to show us here. But also to link it with this power of the dragon, the serpent. And remember, a dragon has a twofold constitution, a terrestrial and a celestial counterpart. They live in caves, right, in grottos within the earth, but they can also come out, because they're winged, they can fly up to the sky. So they have a dual nature, a celestial counterpart and a terrestrial.
When is that image from? I mean,
When? It's probably from like the 1500s, 1600s, right in there. I can get the exact. I have that somewhere. I don't know if I have it in this show or not, but yeah, I have all this stuff referenced for sources and all.
Where did it come from?
It's a one of these many alchemical manuscripts from the like Renaissance and pre-Renaissance times, 1600s, and I can get that. I don't. In putting this together, I don't think I didn't necessarily get all of the references and sources, but I have those.
Who's the androgynous figure coming out of a tree trunk?
Right here.
The base. There's a base that looks like a tree.
Oh, no, I gotta do that here. What are you talking about now?
It looks like a tree stump that the base
Here?
of the androgynous, the brown part.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like that they're forming, growing.
Oh, like a tree stump right
Yeah,
here.
like growing out of a tree kind of connection.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
But what were the two symbols at the top? Or two something at the top? It's the scroll. Never mind.
Yeah. With some Latin, which I have a translation of, but
That other image you showed during the lecture, showed what you called the cosmic battle.
yeah.
When was that image from?
I think that was from the 1800s. Again, I'll try to get that up. I'm going to try to put together all of the sources and references.
So does the metric system have correlation to the human body?
Not,
Varies on
no,
that.
only indirectly. I mean, that's one thing about the metric system. It's like a couple of degrees removed from the human proportions.
It's
Whereas
not on
the
purpose.
traditional ones are directly the inch, the foot, the cubit, elbow to fingertip, the pace, all of those directly related to the human proportion.
Is it done purposely to obscure?
No, I don't know if it was done purposely, I think, but indirectly it had that result. Because originally what the idea of the metric system was to be derived from the Earth itself. And it's taken as 1/100,000th part of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. I think that's it.
I think you're right.
That's the
Sounds
meter.
right.
The meter, yeah. Yeah.
That was whenever the North Pole was,
Well-
where it was at that time.
Well, yeah, in Napoleonic times is when they came up with that. Interestingly, though, the kilometer relates to the mile almost in the inverse of the golden section.
Oh,
You got to get, Tim, do this. Put in the mile 5,280. In round numbers, a kilometer is 3,280, which makes it easy to remember. That's rounded up. But divide 5,280 by 3,280. You should get 1.60 something.
1.6097.
Yeah, and the golden section is 1.618. So it's very close. So here's a good little mnemonic trick. If you're trying to convert between the two, let's say you've got kilometers, right? And you want to convert kilometers to miles in your head. And let's say 120 kilometers, right? Divide it by 10 in your head, right? Now you've got 12. Multiply that by 6. What's 6 times 12? 72. So 120 kilometers is, give or take a mile, is 72 miles. So that's a simple little way to remember that.
The meter is 39 something inches.
39.37 inches.
And a foot is 30, a yard is 36.
And a yard is 36, so it's a little bit more than a yard. Yeah.
So what's the ratio there?
So if what?
What's the ratio there?
I don't know. I don't know. Tim's got the calculator.
So the kilometer is 1/10,000th of the distance from the equator to the pole.
1/10,000th, not
I'm not sure if you
100,000.
said
Yeah. Yes.
Meters or kilometers, but yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's whatever 6,200 miles.
Right.
Gives you your 24/8 around.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 1/10,000th is a kilometer.
That would make sense. Yeah. And then that would make 40,000 kilometers the circumference.
There you go.
Yeah. So then you divide that by 10, and what do you got? 4,000. Multiply that times 6, you get 24,000. Where the actual circumference is closer to 24,881. Depending on where you measure it, because the Earth is not perfectly spherical.
It's an oblate sphere.
Thank you. It's an oblate sphere or oblate spheroid. What does that mean? It means that it's bulged around the middle because it's spinning and it's not completely rigid. It's plastic. It bulges towards the equator. So actually the equatorial diameter is about 7,926 miles. The polar diameter is about 7,900. So there's a 26-mile difference. Now, I use the number 7,920, number one, because that's the traditional number, but also if you take and make a perfect sphere that has the same surface area as the Earth actually does, that sphere will have a diameter of right at 7,920 miles, interestingly. So, but in a lot of the books you'll read, if they're just rounding it off and they're not concerned with the 13-mile difference in equatorial radius and polar radius, they'll typically round it off to 7920. Just like they'll round the moon off to 2,160 miles.
Which brings another question. You described how they measured the distance, the Earth on one side of the sun, 6 months later on the other
Yeah.
side, and triangulation. Did they take into account the 1.4 million mile diameter of the sun and add to
No,
that?
I don't think so. I think initially all they were seeking was a rough approximation of the, the dimensions. Because, there was at one point where they basically thought the universe, that the stars were all fixed on a sphere just outside the orbit of Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this clearly showed that it was a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Randall, what is in the precession of the equinox? What is one age? Is it 2160?
Yeah.
And that's the size of the moon?
In miles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Say that the other concern.
Well, Tamara, did I pronounce your right name? Tamara said that in the precession of the equinoxes, the great year, that the round table, right, divided into 12 months of the great year, each of those is 1/12 of that cycle. The whole cycle, calculator, man, okay, several thousand years ago, back in the time of Aristarchus. Am I supposed to put that on? Or you're just holding it? Okay. Basically, what they did was they very carefully measured, and I think it goes way, way earlier than the Greeks, that they were very interested in the motion of the sun, the precessional motion of the sun, which is the motion of the sun on its axis, right? Okay. Early on, though, they were able to calculate that, or through observations, probably over hundreds of years, determine that that was 50 arc seconds per year. 50 arc seconds, right? Now, in a circle, there are 360 degrees. Each degree is 60 minutes of arc. Each minute of arc is 60 seconds of arc. So what you do is to get the total number of arc seconds in a circle, 360 degrees times 60 minutes times 60 seconds, right? If you do that, in fact, start over again, Tim. Go 360 times 60 times 60. And you will get 1,296,000 seconds of arc. Now, if you get what I'm talking about, full circle, 360 degrees. Each degree is 60 arc minutes. Each arc minute is an arc second. So in the total circle, there's 1,296,000 seconds. Now, precessional motion is 50 arc seconds per year. So divide that number you've got by 50, and you'll have in years the full cycle. And it should be 25,920. 25,000. Now, divide that by 12 to see how long it takes the vernal equinox to transit each of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And you will 2,160. And there it is. And by coincidence, the diameter of the moon, not measured in anything but miles, only miles, is 2,160 miles. Which is interesting because the number you just came up with, 2,160 years, is called a Platonic month. And we know that the word month comes from moon. So again, at what point do you say, okay, this is beyond coincidence? So,
When did the English system of measurement that we're talking about come out?
as far back as I can tell. I mean, it was certainly, I think, in use at the time Stonehenge was built. Now, Stonehenge, I think, is dating to 4,700 years. And the reason I say that is because, and at some point we could actually do a little sidetrack and get into the sacred geometry of Stonehenge. This is one of the things we do in my sacred geometry classes, but it's a series of concentric circles. And the outer circle, which is just pretty much tangent to the outer faces of the sarsen stone circle, is 105.6 feet in diameter, right? 105.6. Now, put that in 105.6 and multiply that times 50 and tell me what you get, Tim.
5,280.
5,280. And the distance, the sarsen stone uprights with the lintels on top, if you draw a circle on the center of those, where the lintels are basically, there's a mortise and tenon kind of a relationship, how they fit them together. And if you draw on the center line of that, the distance between each upright is 10.56 feet. So 10.56 times 30 gives you the total circumference drawn on the center line. Now, not the outer tangent line, the center line. But what that suggests is because you've got 10.56 separating the uprights, and you've got 105.6 defining the whole diameter, would suggest that there was a common unit of measurement there. And what is interesting is that the ancient Sumerian foot was 10.56 inches. So what that means is that the average distance between each of the uprights was exactly 12 of the ancient Sumerian feet. And here's something further. If you take that 10.56, Tim, and because there were 30 lintels around that circle, multiply 10.56 by 30 and tell me what you get.
316.8.
316.8. Where did we see that number earlier? Right? Kurios Jesus Christos, 3,168. At what point do we say this is not a coincidence?
At the beginning, it's a good place.
Okay. Let's just dismiss all this and say it's all coincidence and has no meaning whatsoever. Yes, I have been accused more than once of, you're just playing with numbers. There's no meaning. It's like, hey, is there meaning to anything? Is there meaning to life? Is there meaning to existence? Look, if you're in the psychological state where all of this amazing universe and life within it and consciousness within that life has no meaning to you, well, I can't persuade you otherwise. So I'm not even going to waste my time. All right.
Does that mean class is canceled for next month?
No.
No, I always welcome a healthy skepticism. I mean, an open-minded skepticism, because I'm skeptical myself. When I first encountered this stuff, I'm like, wait a minute. But then, as I got deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole and realized that these connections just keep going and going, I'm going, there's some kind of an underlying pattern or some kind of an underlying structure with meaning to it here. I'm not sure what it is, but it's there. And somewhere along the line, and I don't think it's something that was invented. I think it was something that was discovered, that there's this inherent geometry in creation, in life. Hey, we're walking embodiments of sacred geometry. Hey, the cubit, the golden section is this right here. The wrist joint from fingertip to wrist joint, from wrist joint to elbow. That's it. That's the sacred measure right there.
So wouldn't that mean that everything is in harmony?
It means that, yes. It means that when the machine is tuned and everything, yes, it's just like any machine. It's like your car. If it's out of tune, things don't work right. And I think what we're getting here is the standard. It's like, a mechanic is going to tune your car. They pull out the specifications, says, okay, here's the proper timing, etc., and here's all the settings we have to do to get it to run harmoniously. Right now, we've got the vehicle of the world is out of sync. It's not working properly. It is. That's why there's so much. I think that, the idea in the ancient philosophy was when the world was out of sync, humans became out of sync. That's the whole idea of, the land and the king are one, yes. Mm-hmm. But the ancient doctrine has provided us the specifications for, retuning the world and bringing it in harmony with the cosmos. How about that? As a working hypothesis. Okay. That's all. Thanks.